Hi, I'm David Grease, Professor Emeritus of Computer Science here at Cornell. Sitting next to me is the current Chair of Computer Science, Fred Schneider. Fred joined our faculty as an assistant professor in 1978, and lucky for us, he's been here ever since. He now holds an endowed chair. He's a Samuel B. Eckert Professor of Computer Science. He began serving as our chair in 2014. His PhD thesis was on the structure of concurrent programs exhibiting reproducible behavior. And he continued that kind of work at Cornell on concurrency and operating systems, but I believe it began being tinged with topics that we talked about here, like correctness issues, correctness proofs. He moved into distributed computing, and gradually all of his emphasis are on now what one calls trustworthiness. I'll read what that means. Systems that will perform as expected despite failures and attacks. So anything that helps him get trustworthy systems is what he's interested in. Fred and his work have been quite influential. Let me just read to you a few of his honors. He has a Hall of Fame award for seminal research. He has the Peoria Award from the Computer Society for contributions to trustworthy computing. He has an honorary doctorate, the Doctor of Science honoris causa by the University of Newcastle on Tyne, so that's across the ocean. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and he's also a foreign member of the Norwegian Academy of Technological Sciences. So that comes those honors because of how influential he's been. And with all that, I'm proud to say that I have written a few papers with him, as well as a book. So Fred, you came to Cornell actually in '71 first, as an undergraduate majoring in electrical engineering. But you like computer science, and I think you used the college program to actually major in CS, even though we didn't have an undergraduate major. Why did you do that? Tell us about that.
Yes, that's true, David. In high school, I did quite a lot of programming. It was before computers were widely available, but my high school had some machines and they let me at them. And I thought programming was really pretty easy. And I didn't think you should do something easy in college. I was also interested in building radios and electronics. So I decided that I would come to Cornell to get a legitimate degree in electrical engineering. And I came as a freshman, and after about a year or so, it struck me that electrical engineering was stuff that people knew how to do and was largely boring. And computer science was stuff that people didn't know how to do and seemed to be exciting. And so I changed from majoring in electrical engineering, much to the disappointment of my parents, because I was abandoning a clearly important and useful career for something that nobody had any notion of being important, and tried to major in computer science. But you couldn't major in computer science. You had to take an independent major. In the engineering school, it was called the college program. And so I joined 10 or 15 students a year who would do some kind of major that involved computing courses and something else. And that's how I find so I really was more repelled by where I thought I was going to be than attracted away. I thought computing was delightful and simple, and I didn't think you could actually do that for a living.
It didn't turn out as simple as you thought, did it?
No.
Who was your advisor? You must have had a computer science advisor.
I did. My advisor was first a fellow named Kip Moore, who was one of the people on the faculty who taught operating systems. In fact, Cornell in those days had a small number of people who did systems. The very first person was Alan Shaw, and he was replaced by Kip Moore and then Greg Andrews, and actually getting ahead of ourselves, then me. But Kip was an OS person, and he left before I finished, and went off and became a venture capitalist and did quite well. And after that, it was Ellis Horowitz, who was somebody who worked in data structures and then went to USC, and I see him from time to time still.
Yep. So what were the courses like as opposed to now?
So one clear thing is they were smaller. A large course in those days, well, the intro programming course might be 150 or 200 people, but a standard 300 or 400 level course was 30 or 40 students. And most of them were graduate students. There were very few undergraduate courses in those days. There was a big difference in the amount of programming one did. There was a big mainframe computer on campus, but nowadays we think of using personal machines. And it was a big deal to run a program. You'd submit it and have to wait perhaps hours to get the results back. You didn't interact with programs, you just gave them data and a couple hours later saw some results. So the whole mode of interaction was different. That meant many things we're used to doing, mail, conversation, graphics, things that require interaction to get right were just not something anyone paid attention to. On the other hand, numerical things were very important, round off errors and so on.
I recall right about then, 72 is when Don Greenberg started trying to create pictures, graphical demonstrations of new buildings that they wanted to build and so on.
That's right. Don set up his graphics lab in Rand Hall while I was an undergraduate, and some of my friends went to work with him. I didn't have the good sense to realize that was the next frontier, but I did know it was happening.
So, you graduate from Cornell in computer science and in this independent major in 75. And 3 years later, you get your PhD at Stony Brook. How'd you do it in 3 years? Most of our students take, I think the average is 5.5, and it's been that way for a long time.
Right. So I was lucky and unlucky. The unlucky part is Stony Brook wasn't a great place to live. It was a commuter school, and here I was moving from a place like Cornell where there's a community and a culture, and I lived and breathed this academic culture, to a place where people commuted to school and went home. So there was not a lot of reason to stay at Stony Brook, except for the sailboat racing during the summer, which was one of the reasons I went to start with. But because Cornell didn't have very many undergraduate courses, the way I majored was by taking predominantly graduate courses. So in my undergraduate career, I essentially took all the courses for a PhD in computer science, and I sat with the graduate students in computer science. So I have two sets of friends from college. One set were my undergraduate friends, and the other set were students who were getting their PhD in Cornell CS, and those students tended to be among the top in the nation, and so I know all these really famous people now. But because I had taken all these PhD courses, when I went to Stony Brook, I found myself way ahead of everybody else, and I didn't have to take very many courses, and in some cases I would show up in the course and the professor would ask me how come I knew so much, and I would tell him who I took the course from, and then he'd ask me to bring my notebook in so he could study the notes. And that meant that I essentially was able to start working on my thesis research a year and a half early, and that's what happened.
That reminds me, I remember many of our undergraduates going to graduate school at Stanford, CMU, Berkeley, and they had wonderful theory courses here and systems courses to some extent, and they go there and they're way ahead of everybody else. I don't know whether that still happens these days.
To some extent, our program still has a reputation of having great courses in some areas, and our undergraduates are still highly sought, but they don't get to skip all the coursework for PhDs anymore.
So, you graduate and you look around the country for a place, and I remember everybody talking about how thorough you were in everything you did, and you went to many more places than most new PhDs go to. not because you knew you were going to go there or wanted to, but because you wanted to learn about computer science. Did you really do that?
Well, some of that's true. I did go to many places, over 20. And my girlfriend at the time had bought me a map when I started, and we started putting pins every city I visited. But what happened was Stony Brook was, at the time, so this would be the late 70s, considered the next the Berkeley of the East. It was going to be a state university that would be at the level of Berkeley. And so it wasn't great yet, but everybody wanted it to be great. And that was why they were able to attract some interesting faculty and some up-and-coming PhD students who weren't good enough, like me, to get into Stanford. But being at Stony Brook, I had no idea how I would be received when I went on the job market. And my thesis advisor didn't have a clue either. So I applied to a fairly broad spectrum of universities. Actually, my first thought was I was going to graduate and go into private consulting in New York City and do the kind of business things that my family had thought were legitimate. This idea of being a professor was not considered a legitimate calling. But when I decided to go into research, I didn't know where I fit in, and so I applied broadly, and I was pleasantly surprised that everybody I applied to virtually said, "Oh yes, come interview." And I saw no reason not to do those interviews, and I learned a lot. I generally liked to have this notion of completeness of knowledge, and so the more places I went to, the better perspective I thought I'd have on the field, and I enjoyed meeting people, and that worked out quite well. I was really flattered when Cornell called me. It was not something I ever expected. This was considered a top place, and I never thought I was of that caliber. And when I had the chance, I did come.
That notion of completeness, complete knowledge, I remember we talked about the fact that you read every single paper that crossed your desk when you came here.
Yeah, so this is true.
How long did that last?
This may have lasted for a decade, but to put it in perspective, there were very many fewer papers being written in those days. There was a small number of journals and a small number of conferences. And it actually was possible to read the conference proceedings for all the important operating systems and software engineering conferences, and that's what I would do. And I had this fantasy that I would keep this up, but after about 10 years, the stack of things that I was supposed to read was growing much faster than I was reading. And at some point, I came to the conclusion that I was going to have to put things on my shelf that I had not read yet. And that was kind of a sea change.
This is kind of like Donald Knuth, who in '67, I think, started writing a 7-volume series that would cover all of computer science. And he's finished 4 volumes.
Volume 4, yeah.
And no more will come out. So the field has changed.
It gets bigger.
So tell me about your views on theory and practice or experimentation. I know that you could have joined a department on the West Coast where you would have been sort of viewed as a theoretician. Right. And you come here instead where there's all these theoreticians.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't viewed as a theoretician here.
How did that grab you? And why did you come?
So in those days, there was probably today there still is, but in those days I saw a big schism between people who predominantly built systems and wrote about them and people who predominantly proved theorems. And too much of the work in building systems struck me as stuff that didn't have a long life. You would build the system, you might learn some lessons, but it was very hard to capture the lesson in a way that it would last for a long time. Whereas a theorem, if it was done well, is something that could have influence for a very long time. And having impact is something that drives me. So I found I'm much more attracted to the idea of creating knowledge that's going to last for a long time, and therefore, if you will, theorems were more attractive. On the other hand, I'm not a very good mathematician. So the idea of being a theoretician is a crazy one, and I rather thought of myself as somebody who could look at systems problems. I do know a fair bit, or in those days I did know a fair bit about building systems, and try to extract lessons from that by trying to build models. People will think of it as formalizing things, but the important thing is abstracting what's important, and from that abstraction deriving truths that would have a long life. And that started with my PhD thesis, where I looked at some issues in concurrency, but even before that I had looked at some issues in computer security. And Cornell actually was a place where there were people who were doing what might be called theoretical systems. Because Cornell was so theory heavy, in order to be legitimate, if you were in systems, you would have to do something that the theory people would respect. And that meant doing something that was rigorous and involved some kind of theory. And therefore, there were people here who tried to bridge that gap. And that's something that I found very attractive. I looked around at who was having a big impact in the field of systems, and there were people who built systems who were doing it, but there were also this new generation of people who were trying to define new languages and new language abstractions, because the belief then was if you wrote systems in these new languages, the systems would more likely have certain interesting properties. And that was attractive. It's kind of a myth, though. It's like saying that if you write letters in French, they'll be love letters, and if you write letters in German, they'll be rigorous treaties. It doesn't work that way, that language will shape your thought that much. But in those days, we believed that languages and the right abstractions could make a difference. To some extent they do, but not as much as we wished.
I recall, as you were speaking about theorems, that small things that you can prove that have an influence, you had one with Owen Alpern, safety and liveness.
Right.
Right? A very nice little idea, which you really hit right on the nail.
Right. So in those days, some early work by a fellow named Leslie Lamport, who just recently won the Turing Award, that's the top award in our field, had observed that the properties you'd like to know about programs are either some bad thing doesn't happen or some good thing does happen, or some combination of that. And said in English, it sounds like it ought to cover the space. But the question is, does it really cover the space? It happens it doesn't, but in those days our space was much smaller, and our space was to view computations just as the sequence of steps and not anything broader. And you'd like to know that that really covered the space. So what Bowen, Alpern, and I did was actually came up with a formal definition for liveness. There was a formal definition for safety that people had talked about. Leslie Lamport had proposed it. And we were able to prove not only that there was this definition, well, anybody can make a definition, but we were able to prove that every property could be decomposed into safety and liveness. And that meant they were, if you will, a basis out of which you could build anything you were interested in for programs. And so that's a definition which comes with a theorem. And actually from that theorem, we were then able to show that if it was a safety property, it would have to be proved in a particular way. And if it was a liveness property, there was this other recipe. And so that was a definition that if you understood it, it gave you the direction for making the next step. And so this is a case where formalizing something brings enormous value in addition to just creating a label and some formula.
Dijkstra used to talk about that there's no distinction between theory and practice. You can't do one without the other.
Right.
He used to say that.
Good theory takes practice.
Yes.
And I mean it in both ways.
Yes. So your early work was in concurrency and also fault-tolerant distributed computing. That's an odd combination in a sense, isn't it?
Yes. So my thesis was in concurrency. That was this reproducible behavior. And actually I came to Cornell because you, David, had done some seminal work in how to reason about concurrency with Susan Nowicki, your PhD student, and I thought if I could learn that, I'd be great. So I came here expecting to work in concurrency. And shared memory concurrency, that's where many activities are communicating with a shared memory, was a solved problem. That's what you had done with Susan. And those were the days when people started to have microprocessors, and so we started to think about computing systems where the processors were separated and they interacted with each other using message passing. So figuring out how to reason about programs with message passing was the next big problem. That was the step beyond what the Grisa-Wiki theory had explained. And I started to work on how to reason about message passing programs. And I did this, and I started to write a paper about this method. And the first sentence said something like, well, if you have a distributed system, it can be fault tolerant because the physically separated processors will fail independently. And then the paper went on to describe this protocol I was working on. And my experience is when I write, I use writing as a way to discover truths. And that's because I can read stuff very critically, even if I've written it. And I read that sentence, and it occurred to me that the whole rest of the paper ignored the concern about processors failing. And in fact, a theory for message passing might be interesting, but it was not going to be all that practical unless you also understood how to build systems that could tolerate failures. And so at that point, my career kind of forked into one part that was looking at the formal methods, reasoning about concurrency with message passing, and in another part, looking at protocols and the design of systems that would tolerate failures. And they really were two separate kinds of disciplines. There were two separate communities. I could cheat in that I knew how to use techniques for one to make the other easier, but that was not something I would show in the papers because the communities wouldn't appreciate it. But I got into fault tolerance because I realized that the motivation for the other work was really incomplete.
He mentioned writing. He's able to read critically. I can vouch for that. I wrote a book with him, A Logical Approach to Discrete Math. And very often I would write a chapter and give it to him, and it would come back with green pen scribbled on it, and there was more green pen than there were words that I had been written. And I would revise it and give it to him. It would come back a little bit less green. And this would go on until finally that chapter was exactly right. I think we worked very well together with that.
Yes, I learned a lot writing that. My students now understand that when I change something back and forth 3 times to the same word, then they realize that we're done.
He had a 60th birthday party, was it last year or the year
2
before?
years ago.
2 years ago. And there, his graduate students had T-shirts saying, "I survived writing a paper with Fred Schneider." Yes, and I have one of those. So you're now focusing on cybersecurity. What is that, and what caused you to make that transition?
When I was in graduate school and when I was an undergraduate, I actually aspired to work in computer security. I thought that was cool. The person I started to do my thesis work at Stony Brook was in cybersecurity, and he was denied tenure at the end of a year, and pragmatism dictated that I not do a thesis in cybersecurity, and that's actually how I got into concurrency. So this was in the back of my mind for a long time, and also while a graduate student, as you noted, I read a lot, so I had read many of the early papers. So I got sidetracked into concurrency and formal methods and fault tolerance. And I was then put on a National Academy study as the fault tolerance expert. This was a study that ultimately produced a volume called Trust in Cyberspace, and it was about the fact that our society was becoming dependent on these networked systems, and unless we did a better job of designing and implementing them, our society was going to crumble.
That was the Committee on Improving Cybersecurity Research of the National Research Council?
The National Research Council. So I was on this committee, and My formal methods, I had just finished a book on formal methods, a book on concurrent programming, and I was kind of depressed because after I had published it, not very many people were paying attention to it. There were several competitor formal systems, and each group seemed to be interested in their own system and not so interested in other systems or taking a broad view. So I was, if you will, at my intellectual midlife crisis. And here I found myself on a committee where the nation's best cybersecurity experts, there were about a dozen of us, and a couple of tokens like me who understood things like fault tolerance were there to help try to understand the big picture. Well, when you're in that group, you have an easy way to ask stupid questions and learn from the best. And I use this as an opportunity then to come up to speed again on cybersecurity. It was clear that this was a big growth area because more and more attacks were taking out systems. In fact, the attacks were growing exponentially, whereas failures were growing at the rate of squirrels eating transformer coils and so on. And so the real growth area was in cybersecurity. I had this wonderful group of people who could tutor me. And I had the fortune and misfortune to have one of these Leonard Bernstein moments. The chair of the committee ended up having to resign. And I had been fairly active, and so the Academy asked me if I would chair the committee for the last year or so and organize things. And that meant when the report was done, I was the person who went around and gave all the briefings. So all of a sudden, I was talking to fairly high-level groups, both in government and academia, and I was portrayed as the expert on this content. And so instantly, I was a national cybersecurity expert, and that's something you can't let pass. Yeah. I had always wanted to work in cybersecurity. I had, therefore, my launch, and I continued that way. So I was lucky because I had expertise in how to reason about programs. That's one reason a system is not trustworthy. I had expertise in how to tolerate failures from my earlier work, and now I was in dealing with malevolent sorts of actions, and so I fortunately knew all three of the pillars of trustworthiness, and that just allowed me to have a very useful perspective on these systems.
I find that very interesting. That's not the right word. It's just nice how that all fit together.
Luck favors the prepared mind.
Luck is opening the door when opportunity knocks.
Yes.
So you besides that particular service, you've done a huge amount of service in computer science. You're now on the board of the Computing Research Association, the CRA, started in 1988. I counted on your vita about 20 different advisory boards and councils that you've been on since about 2001, in the past 15 years. Microsoft Academic Advisory Board, the PCAST Technical Advisory Group on Networking and Information Technology. You chaired UK International Review of Computer Science. These are big time-consuming things. And I can ask several questions. How did you find time for all that service? And I know that service benefited the others, but did it benefit you as a faculty member? And would you recommend to a faculty member, and a younger person, how much of that should they do? And did that change your perspective on computer science? How's that for lots of questions all at once?
That are a lot of questions. Yeah. So let me say a bit about how I got into this. It has changed my perspective, and I basically started doing this for entirely selfish reasons. I believed that you could have more leverage if you knew first where the field was going. And you would find out where the field was going by rubbing shoulders with the leaders of the field. And the leaders of the field were people who you would find on these boards. So having a chance to talk to people who are at the top not only is a lot of fun and engaging, but it seemed like it would give me an edge in asking the right questions and knowing the right answers. So that's how I went into it. At Cornell, when I joined, Juris Hartmanis, who helped found the department, was very active in this kind of national policy. And I revere Juris, and it was clear because we would all have lunch together every day, and then I was fortunate to be able to have lunch with him on Saturdays because we both were working on Saturdays. It was clear that his perspective on the field was shaped very much from being asked questions that these panels would ask, and from having a chance to work through them with other top people. So I decided whatever was good for Juris was good for me, and really tried to replicate the kinds of things he was doing. And therefore I aspired to do these things. In fact, I desperately wanted to serve on a National Academy panel, and Juris is the person who arranged for me to be on the Trust in Cyberspace panel, which it really changed my career. I also didn't have any misconceptions that I was any good at this, and I typically would use these as a way to learn how to be more effective. So in Trust in Cyberspace, Marjorie Blumenthal, who was then the director of the Academy Board, taught me how to write. And writing for these kinds of government reports is a very different style of writing than you do for a research paper or than you do for an advocacy piece. And so I learned that, and if you learn that and you can do that well, then other people come after you. And so it bootstrapped into a situation where people were asking me to do things because not only might I get something out of it, but they were getting something out of it. And one of the roles of universities in the United States is to be a public service and to be a cache of expertise. The reason the US doesn't have to have huge laboratories of government employees is because we have all this expertise in the professorial ranks. And when you need an expert on some esoteric thing, the government can come into a university and ask somebody if they would help. And since the universities are largely supported by government grants, it's almost a duty to help. And so I take that duty seriously. And then there's been this third wave, which is my recent involvement in the Defense Department. And it's quite simply, we as a country need the help. They need all the help they can get. You worry that the very brightest are not able to spend time for all kinds of reasons. And you don't want the country to be deprived of that. And so here's a case where I just think we owe it to the nation to do it. But I have learned an enormous amount. And my time in the Defense Department, my time on the Microsoft, running the Microsoft Advisory Board, has given me a perspective about technical problems, what's real, what's not, about solutions, what's feasible, what's not, that you couldn't get by just being in the university. So if we come back to the opening comments you made about building systems versus doing theory, it's true that I don't program systems, but I get as close as you can to people who program real systems. Not people who build systems in universities that are research prototype, but people, I used to spend time regularly with the people who would build the next generation of the Windows operating system. And that's an extremely efficient way for me to find out what are the real problems without having the overhead of building this enormous artifact that you need to build in order to get to the real problems. So I have found this advisory board stuff, at least the technical parts of it, as a very efficient way to quickly come to understand the problem and the circumstances. And since the way to do great research is to pick the right problems, I have this edge on choosing the right problems. I've kind of drifted into policy as a result of this. You can't spend time in Washington and not
Not
see
the
that.
policy.
And this is another instance of bridging the gap between what was originally systems and theory, but it's now bridging the gap between policy, which is also unruly and doesn't have elegant formalizations, and science, which does. And bridging that gap, if to the extent to which you could bring scientific discipline to how you make policy, given the constraints that policy is driven by people and money and interests, but really gives me a point of leverage and allows me to look at things in a way that's different than most people do.
This amazing change in computer science, that vision you just gave, how you work on these boards and so on, as opposed to how we started in 65 up to 75, when we didn't talk to anybody outside of computer science, and all we were wondering about was how do we prove this particular program correct, or how do we build this operating system. It's a tremendous change in the field.
This change was really pushed by Hart Manis, who served on this National Academy panel called Computing the Future, in which he came back to the field and he said, okay, folks, computer science will grow the best if we start looking to outside fields to find out what problems they have to solve, because their problems could well inform our challenges. And also if we do outreach to the other fields. And that changed the perspective of the scientific agenda in a significant way. And of course, the growth of industry and the prevalence of computing changes the dialogue quite a bit, and you can't ignore the reality of how our stuff is being used.
So, last question. How is the department different today than when it was you joined in 78? By the way, what was there about the department that kept you here? I'd like to know that. And also, how is it different and how is it the same?
Right. So I was attracted to Cornell because it was the best department of those that made me an offer. But as an undergraduate here, I formed a model of what a computer science department was like, just because this is where I grew up. And in retrospect, it should not be surprising when I looked for a job that Cornell looked the most like what I thought a computer science department should look like. That's something that only occurred to me some years after I joined. I very much like the idea of a department that's collegial and is not about not the European model where each individual professor runs its own standalone operation and there isn't a lot of communication between them. So Cornell's tradition when I joined of not having faculty meetings and every day going to lunch to talk about the problems of the day, but also to talk about management issues in the department is something that I thought was wonderful. Now that I'm department chair, I would love to return to those days so I didn't have to run faculty meetings every week. But that was a time when, if you will, there was a benevolent dictatorship. The chair did what the chair thought was right, informed by discussions as opposed to being mastered by these discussions. So one thing was the department was small, collegial, and we thought of ourselves as a community of scholars rather than individuals. The department has certainly gotten larger. The department's gotten way more diverse. I was told that I was hired as a way of trying to ramp up the systems activity in the department. Well, in retrospect, that's pretty amusing because they hired a theoretician to ramp up the systems activity, and only theoreticians could think about doing that. But we now have real live systems people for whom building an artifact is the way to discover interesting problems. And that's a very valid way of doing research. It's some of our competition, Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley, for example, are very focused on that. I like to kid people that there are two views. One is think first, build second, which is what we do at Cornell. We try to come up with an idea and build something as a way of validating it, as opposed to, instead of think first, build second, you could imagine build first, think second, which is the activity of building forces you to realize where the problems are, and then you have to think about it. So now we're diverse enough so we have both views. And when you get large like that, intellectually large, then this communication is a little bit trickier. It's more difficult to come to decisions, and so we're different that way. When I came to Cornell, there were certain areas that were considered unlikely to lead to anything interesting, and certain areas that were seen as important. So computational science, numerical methods was a big thing in the department then. It has since gotten smaller, not because it's not important, but because it's all over the engineering college. Yes. Artificial intelligence was frowned on in those days. We've since built up quite a credible group. We have one of the top groups in the country in machine learning. So some areas have grown in the department that people in the late 70s would never have imagined. That's a difference. We have a building now and space, and we have an undergraduate program, which we didn't have. We have a master's program, which we didn't have. And all those things require not only management, but they force you to think about things differently. Having courses that will appeal to undergraduates is a different issue than having courses that will appeal to PhD students. And so we're much more of a full-service department, and in that way, we're more like our competitors than we used to be. But I think, whereas in the late 70s when I came, we were a top department and we were a pound for pound top department. Today, you can't be a top department if you're small. You can only be a top department if you're broad and if you're large. And so pound for pound excellence isn't nearly as important as having a big enough mass so that and having the excellent people be as excellent as any place else. So if you will, the value system for what's important has changed since I've arrived.
Well, I was chair back in '83, I think. It certainly was different. You have a much harder job with a lot more complex issues to handle, and I'm glad you're there doing a good job.
You're glad you're not there.
Yes, 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 yes. No, he's doing a wonderful job.
It's an honor.